We have a Slack channel where we put up press releases and blog posts from our competitors. We don't only do that for awareness, we do that to remind our teams that our competitors are not complacent, they're not asleep, they're constantly moving, they may be chasing us or they're trying to differentiate themselves doing it their way, but that should be something that says, hey, I can't be asleep at the wheel here. This is a constant race.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Welcome back to Run the Numbers, the podcast where we cut through the finance jargon and get real about what it takes to lead in today's business world. Today, I'm joined by my friend David Lapter, the CFO of Dashlane. We had dinner last night, actually. David is a great hang. And we're going to talk about the lessons he's learned in the trenches of high-growth companies. We're diving into blind spots, why CFOs tend to double down on what they're good at, looking at you, FP&A, and avoid the things that make them sweat. Hello, cash flow forecasting. CJ ain't so good at that. David shares how he's tackled his own gaps and why too much execution mode, which is a good word, can be a trap. We're also talking competitors. Should you ignore them, respect them, or call them out by name? David explains why demonizing the competition is lazy and how real differentiation starts with owning your own story. And of course, we're breaking down high-functioning teams, when to move from overlapping roles to clear swim lanes, why OKRs can fail, and how to avoid the operational domino effects that can blindside your team. Stick around, this one's packed with insight, a little humility, and maybe a few lessons learned along the way. All this and much, much more after a short word from our sponsors. Trust isn't earned, it's demanded. Whether you're a startup founder navigating your first audit or a seasoned security professional scaling your GRC program, proving your commitment to security has never been more critical or complex. That's where Vanta comes in. Businesses use Vanta to establish trust by automating compliance needs across over 35 frameworks, like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. Centralized security workflows, complete questionnaires up to 5 times faster, and proactively manage vendor risk. Vanta not only saves you time, it can also save you money. A new IDC white paper found that Vanta customers achieve $535,000 per year in benefits, and the platform pays for itself in just 3 months. Join over 9,000 global companies like Atlassian, Cora, and Factory, who use Vanta to manage risk and improve security in real time. For a limited time, our audience gets $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/metrics. That's vanta.com/metrics for $1,000 off. Here's a question. Do you feel like you're wasting time and energy on contract renewals or tracking shadow IT spend or, this is a bad one, explaining rising software costs to the board? Truth is, traditional spend management is broken. That's where Tropic comes in. Tropic is an intelligent spend management solution that consolidates your spend data and processes into one unified offering, enabling insights and decisive action. It doesn't just show you where the problems are, it helps you solve them. From spotting hidden optimization opportunities like duplicative spend to automating those painful procurement workflows to giving you the best market data that turns every vendor negotiation in your favor. I'm a Tropic customer myself. I've been using them for over a year, and I love their price checks. They allow me to see if I'm getting a fair market deal instantly. And I'm proud to say that I am no longer using my email as our company's contract repository. I've got every document and renewal neatly organized in my Tropic portal. Isn't it time to turn spend management into your competitive advantage? Visit tropicapp.io/mostlymetrics to see what's possible when intelligence drives your decisions. tropicapp.io/mostlymetrics. What does the future hold for business? Ask 9 experts and you'll get 10 answers. Bull market, bear market. Rates will rise, rates will fall. Can someone please just invent a crystal ball already? Until then, over 40,000 businesses have future-proofed their companies with Netsuite by Oracle, the #1 cloud ERP, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one fluid platform. With one unified business management suite, there's one source of truth, giving you the visibility and control you need to make quick decisions. With real-time insights and forecasting, you're peering into the future with actionable data. Whether you're closing the books in days, not weeks, you're spending less time looking backwards and more time on what's next. If you listen to this podcast, you'll know I ask CFOs all the time to rep their tech stacks, and I would say almost every one of them use NetSuite. And that's what I would use too. Whether you're a company earning millions or even hundreds of millions, NetSuite helps you respond to immediate challenges and seize your biggest opportunities. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/metrics. The guide is free to you. That is netsuite.com/metrics. Ooh, yeah, it's netsuite.com/metrics. Please, guys, I really need this. David, welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Thanks for having me.
So I know you're a CFO, but I feel like if that doesn't work out, you could be a late night DJ talk show host.
I'll take that not only as a compliment, but a plan B I can now put aside.
We were joking before we hit play. I was like, you have a very baritone voice. And did you say you actually used to sing?
I used to sing in high school, so it's a few years ago, but I do remember loving it and being part of the choir. Maybe half your audience will now turn off, but hopefully not.
No. Well, they're going to stick around for the hot takes that we got coming here.
I promise I won't sing during this episode.
It is on Spotify, but I don't think the album will be available. We're going to jump into all sorts of CFO topics. And the first one, which I think you're really brave to come on and speak about this and be vulnerable and honest, is talking about blind spots, because I'm not really one for New Year's resolutions where like you write down like these are the things that I'm maybe not as good at and I have to improve upon them in this next year. But I guess just in the spirit of continuous improvement here, David, how have you, you're a successful CFO, how have you identified any working habits or skill sets that you need to improve on?
Yeah, and they fall into various categories. They're also situational, and they're also different in time. There are blind spots and issues like that last a long time. To build on the analogy of a blind spot, we all know blind spots as something related to, you're driving and you've got a blind spot, right? So you've got blind spots that exist and are defined by how often you change cars, right? You might lease a car for 3 years and, that blind spot is not changing. And then you've got, an accident. Somebody comes out of nowhere and, it blindsides you and you get a whiplash and all that. But I think you could take all types of blind spots in business that can fit into each of those categories. So you need to my rule of thumb is, especially recently, I figured out as we've passed milestones at Dashlane, I've got to make and reserve the time to diagnose and think at different altitudes and different angles about things I don't normally think about.
That's a great perspective. And I love the car analogy because I've had a couple of SUVs that had like literally the worst blind spot in the world. Like if you didn't have a backup camera, you're going to hit whatever was behind you. But situationally, it does change because your blind spots as a CFO at like a Series A stage could very well be different than that of a CFO at a pre-IPO stage.
Yeah, 100%. And that also emanates from your role as a CFO in a Series C, Series A company. You truly are the sparring partner of the CEO in just about every aspect of the business. You may not be a domain expert in technology. That's usually the first I'll admit. Like I am not a technologist, so I stay out of that swim lane. But for many other aspects, you are that sparring partner. And the bigger you scale, at our scale today, I may have a point of view, but the areas I obsess over are let's say a slightly tighter angle.
Do you think blind spots are more relevant to what we're talking about when it comes to like understanding your business, or do you think it's more like a skill set? Like I have a blind spot that I'm not a CPA by trade. Like that would be an example.
I think it's both to have just like an easy answer. I'm not a CPA either, and so it's probably a natural tendency. I'm assuming you would have the same as me. I started my career as just a generalist, a strategist. I was in consulting and then VC. So where are the angles that I'll naturally know are my blind spots? Well, there are going to be accounting, like hardcore GAAP accounting or foreign accounting and taxes. And then secondly, legal. As early stage CFOs, I think we're all forced to play a lawyer on TV.
Oh, yeah.
We fake it. But at some point, you've got to put your hand up and say, okay, I can no longer do this. I'm slowing down the business. But when you get to FP&A and analytics, that's where we feel, and I'm projecting that you and I think are similar.
Oh
here.
yeah, I'm with you, man. Yeah,
you're at home, right? And you don't want to give up that territory. And by that natural human tendency, which again, I think goes way beyond just the office of the CFO, that natural tendency is going to give you a blind spot because over time, no matter how young or old you are, you're not giving yourself a chance to bring on people who have a different point of view and probably know a lot more recent ways of working, of what tool sets to use, how to model. And I've experienced that in FP&A as we've scaled at Dashlane.
And you're spot on, because I started in consulting, then went over to later stage private equity for a while, and then ended up on the operating side. And there I kind of got my feet under me in the FP&A world. So like somebody throws me into an operating plan, I feel at home, but somebody throws me into, I don't know, an accrual forecast, like I'm lost at sea. I do think that like a skill in and of itself, though, is raising your hand and saying, I need to hire somebody here, rather than just saying, I'm just going to go with what I'm comfortable with over here.
100% right. And it's doing that. And also there are moments, I've been a CFO 5 times over 20 years. So there are definitely many moments where I felt this urge of desperation. I must fill this role. I desperately need this because I'm trying to do my job and this other job for too long. But the reality is you can't give in to the urge of lowering the bar to fill a role. Like I had one role at Dashlane in the last, 8.5, 9 years that took me almost 2 years to fill. I'm just happy I never lowered the bar because it's been a game changer for us.
Can you say more about that? Because I do think there are CFOs who feel like, crap, I don't know this. I just need like a warm body in here to help me fill this blind spot.
Yeah. So let's be clear. Those areas that I completely would either not want to do or cannot take, for example, that CPA. When I've joined new companies, that was my number one, priority, right? How do I fill that role? Hopefully that role's already filled, but if not, how do I fill that role with somebody I can trust who can be my partner, at least for the foreseeable future? Okay. But then you take the example of FP&A. At Dashlane, we had somebody run FP&A a long time ago at Dashlane, shortly after I joined the company, and at some point after, as I said, 8-9 years, that person moved on in their career, and that's okay. The question is, how do you fill those shoes, right? Do you desperately say, okay, I've got to rush and just fill this role so that I can sleep at night? And God knows I lost a little bit of sleep in that 1.5, 2 years, but we took the time to assess the right person, to keep that bar really high, interviewing candidate after candidate, and literally through a couple of phases. And there were times when I probably did a half-assed job running FP&A to the detriment of the team that I was trying to manage. So I'm grateful to them for putting up with me. But, bringing on a true seasoned leader of FP&A made a world of difference.
This is maybe a weird way to actually ask about the same scenario, but I know you're really good at FP&A. You came from that world. Do you also think there's a tendency, though, to hold on to something that you're good at and not want to give it to somebody else to free yourself up?
100%. And as I said, it's, and I'm happy you phrased it that way. It is a human tendency, right? Some people are better at it. They see it coming. They see themselves being pulled into a bigger role or a different role, and they need to address that. That's one of the things I've struggled with, delegation, right? How do I give up, especially the things that are my sweet spot that I'm very comfortable with? But I'll tell you, doing so is a big relief, can be a big relief. And if you onboard somebody right, so you're hiring, carefully, and you onboard somebody right, you're not only relieving yourself of time, freeing yourself up to think about other blind spots the business has, not just you, but the business, but also you're putting somebody else who's obviously promising in their career on a path to continued learning and development from you. I mean, they're starting by having the opportunity to learn from you. So I think it's like win-win-win.
I was recently introduced to this framework called the Eisenhower Matrix, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but it's basically like, what's the combination of urgency versus importance? And if you like, if something's urgent and important, you got to do it now. But there are a lot of things in our lives as CFOs that are very important, but like they're not urgent. They're just kind of burning in the background. And I think like sitting down and identifying your blind spots are one of them. Do you have any like strategies or frameworks to actually force yourself to say, hey, David, like this is something that I probably need to either brush up on or take the time to go and hire?
Yeah. Oh, God. I'm a big fan of the Eisenhower framework. And I have to, I'll give credit to Mark Suster, who's a dear friend of mine at Upfront Ventures. And I remember, the first job I had as a CFO, he was the CEO of the company. This was back in London 20 years ago. And at some point, he sat down and we talked about the Eisenhower framework and how I was applying it in my job.
He's a legend. Yeah. I've read a lot of this stuff.
It was a big first time CFO kind of lesson learned for me to be aware of that. And I use it, maybe not religiously in like, let's write it down, but rather without saying it, I think about things that way as I work with my direct reports and assess the key projects, their prioritizations, that they have with their teams, be it accounting, legal, FP&A, and so on. And, for me, one of the things that I regularly try and force on the team is, do we have the right balance of the short term and the long term, right? And I think that may not always be a solution to the traps that are defined in the Eisenhower framework is trying to solve for. But usually it's that it's that long-term perspective stuff.
Yes.
It may be important, it may be urgent, but it's probably the urgency can be enforced, created, protected by having a balance between the short and the long term, if you know what I mean. For example, we're doing a big project right now, and it's going to take quarters around integrating Salesforce and Netsuite on a long-term path to having a single source of truth. And so, that's something that if you're trapped in the day-to-day grind, whether you're in RevOps or accounting, you're never going to get to that project. In fact, you may be afraid of it. So you've got to make room for that long term. And I'm not saying the balance is 50-50.
Right.
It probably has its ebbs and flows. When accounting is busy doing their monthly close, it's probably 0, and that's okay. But I'd like to think about it that way.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Does your revenue recognition process feel like a total guessing game? Step right up and pick a card, any card. You're not alone. Revenue accounting is getting more complex, especially with subscription models, usage-based billing, and evolving compliance standards. Woohoo! RightRev is here to help you gain control over your revenue accounting. RightRev automates the revenue recognition process from end to end. Whether it's multi-element arrangements, subscription renewals, or complex usage-based contracts, RightRev takes care of it all. That means fewer spreadsheets, fewer errors, and more time for your team to focus on growth. Customers like Snowflake, Logic Monitor, and Epicor chose RightRev to manage their high volume and complex revenue accounting. CFOs can see the bigger picture faster without being held up by their team's reporting nightmares. You know me, I'm a business model fanatic. And don't get me wrong, I love all the evolutions. We've got self-serve revenue, usage-based revenue, and now even success-based revenue, you name it. But that doesn't make it any easier for us bean counters on the back end to keep score. RightRev is like a cheat code for staying ahead of revenue complexities. So you're ready to transform your revenue accounting? Visit RightRev.com to schedule a demo. That's RightRev.com and tell them your boy CJ sent. RightRev, modern revenue recognition simplified. Oh yeah. Ready to plan confidently, close faster, and report with accuracy? Here's what sets Planful apart. Imagine purpose-built solutions for every department, from FP&A to accounting, marketing to HR, all with built-in financial intelligence. It's easy to implement Planful in just weeks with minimal IT involvement, enabling seamless collaboration across your organization's key financial workflows. Best of all, Planful grows with you. Its unmatched scalability ensures that no matter how fast your business expands, Planful can keep up. See why over 1,500 customers worldwide choose Planful as their flexible, user-friendly, end-to-end financial performance management platform. Visit planful.com/metrics to see how you can elevate your team this year with Planful. They will hook you up. It is planful.com/metrics. Tell them your boy CJ sent you. Planful.com/metrics. Listen, being a CFO, it's not always that glamorous. Sometimes I find myself watering the plants and taking out the garbage in the office. And, the best CFOs I know they're true business leaders. They know how to drive growth in heroic fashion. Unfortunately, the status quo of finance makes that really hard because day to day, we're mostly up to our eyeballs in spreadsheets and receipts. Thankfully, there's a financial provider who has built a solution to match your ambition, Brex. Brex designed a modern corporate card and spend platform that controls spend proactively and automates tedious expense and accounting tasks. Brex frees up CFOs to focus on the high-impact projects that drive growth. The shit that's actually worth your CFO time. So how does Brex work? You can embed your expense policy inside the corporate card to prevent out-of-policy spend before it happens. Receipts and memos are auto-generated, so you always have what you need to close the books fast. Managers get freed up from reviewing, every possible expense under the sun because in-policy expenses are auto-approved and AI will flag any exceptions. And all the while, your expense detail is syncing with your ERP because Brex integrates with almost all of them. I love that, from QuickBooks to Netsuite. It's your time to shine as the strategic growth driver you are, and Brex can make it easy. More than 30,000 companies like DoorDash, Coinbase, and SeatGeek use Brex to make every dollar and every minute count. Join them at brex.com/metrics. That's brex.com/metrics. You've warned against something called execution mode syndrome. What's that? Because I feel like you're hinting at it here.
Well, I'll give you the example that comes to mind when I use those words because it's like a tattoo or a scar from a past life. When we were when I was CFO of Fab.com, a startup that was very, very well known and followed, raised a lot of money in a short period of time, grew from 45 to almost 700 in the span of 2.5 years. It truly felt like whether it was an acquisition or an expansion or a change of business model, expansion of our SKU count and positioning and so on and so forth, we were always executing on a decision being made and rarely had reserved the time to step back, assess, and not only assess where things were working, but also assess where were the warts, where were the tumors that may have been just starting to grow that we should have jumped on top of. So a lot of lessons learned in terms of, not staying out of execution mode, because the truth is you'll always, the cram times will come and go, but they can't just fester, and you've got to make sure that they have their day. Or as a CFO, as an exec team, you've got to be able to pass those things on to a team that's going to execute so that you can keep a broader perspective and monitor.
It's such a nuanced balance because teams can also fall into the trap of just thinking big picture about stuff and never actually going and executing. There are a lot of books written about strategy, not many about execution, but teams can also shy away from picking up their head and being like, what the hell are we doing here? On a 3-year basis. And they get trapped in the minutia of the day to day.
Yeah, exactly. And I find that also when you're in execution mode, you also often forget the two key things, which is, one, am I spreading myself too thin? And when I say I don't mean necessarily you as an individual contributor, but are we as a team, are we as a company spreading ourselves too thin? So this is a big theme for us in 2024 and in 2025. How are we ruthlessly prioritizing? I dare say 2 to 3 things. I'd rather accomplish 2 to 3 things than accomplish 50% and poorly at that of 10 things. Okay, you won't be judged necessarily on how many things you accomplish. It's just how well you execute them, right? And how well you plan them and so on and so forth. So I think a lot about, not spreading yourself too thin, and then thinking about the efficiency and measurement behind the things you actually do. I remember being in a meeting a few years ago, and the CEO had just joined a discussion about something that was being done, and the meeting did not go well. And sometimes it's those meetings that don't go well, where you learn a lot about executive presence and behavior and things like that. And the CEO was most upset. What triggered him, to use that word, was the definition of done. And there was no alignment in that meeting very clearly amongst the cross-functional team members around that everybody had defined done the same way. And we all walked away a little bit like shocked. But after digesting that, I think we all came back to the table, and then for the years to come with other projects, with a little more refined sense of appreciation, of respect for what done truly should mean.
We recently spoke to the CFO of Miro, Justin Colombe, and what he was saying is that he encourages his team, like you just mentioned, David, pick up 2, max 3 things at a time and be absolutely world class at doing it and getting it done. Because I'd rather you be world class at those, and it almost feels not boring, but like you're really honing in on like a very narrow either skill set or set of tasks, than be mediocre at 20 things and be able to show me this list of things that you're quote unquote doing.
Yeah, 100%. And it's natural if you're going to be in the spotlight, if you're getting a lot of press, if you're raising a lot of money. Let's put aside economic cycles, that it's hard not to not believe your own hype, but just feel like you could do no wrong. But time and time again, if we go to examples of companies that have faltered or had very tough moments, maybe they've come out of it, it very often will it will emanate from trying to do too much. And I'll go back to that example at fad.com. We had an amazing executive team, talented people at the table with all the best intentions. But I think our growth ambitions and the pressure of growth put us in a place where we just did way too much, too fast.
Well, this funny thing also happens that once you start to get some hype or people view you as successful, you get all these other opportunities, but it also takes away from the bandwidth of what made you originally, quote unquote, good at the first thing.
Totally right. No, you stay somewhat, you got to be adaptive, but stay true to what made you special, that special sauce. Be aware of it. It's really important.
You got to make the main thing. David, I want to transition a bit to talking about competitors. It sounds very meta when I say it that way. Let's talk about talking about competitors. Yeah. So we often have to talk about our position in the market and who we compete against. What's your philosophy when it comes to speaking about other players in the market?
I may come across as this hopeless optimist or romantic, or having a romantic view in a way on competitive landscapes. Obviously, this is a business. Sectors have competitors, and you can be at different stages in the development of a sector, whether it's all greenfield, whether you're not even competing when you're speaking to a prospect, to competing, but it's still a new purchase, to trying to oust the competition, right? So there are there's that clear spectrum, but I like to approach it from a position of respect. Start by respecting the different players in your sector. Okay, know who are the main players. You don't need necessarily to obsess over 100 players. Like in our sector, there are 4 other players we look at. We're amongst 5 that are names, let's say, that are known. We have differentiation points, but you got to start by respecting your competitors. Know that you have more in common than you think. You're all playing in the same space. You have a shared passion for what problems in society you're trying to solve. We're in cybersecurity. I trust and I start thinking that every one of our 4 competitors equally have the ambition to solve these problems for their clients. So I think that brings us together. The other thing, and it's not necessarily every sector is like this, but you and I both know in technology, you've got big tech. And big tech are important partners of ours, but at the same time, big tech in certain elements can be a competitive threat to smaller players that are trying to establish themselves, trying to innovate. And what I'd like to say is, if there are opportunities for the small players to collaborate, to try and have a louder voice in partnering with and changing the landscape and changing the way big tech is actually thinking about things, because chances are big tech is part of paving the road for the smaller innovative ventures. So how do you work with each other to be able to have that bigger impact? And if you trample on your competitors every day, talk negatively about them first, number one, you're going to make it very hard to collaborate outside. We do a lot of work, for example, in our space with the FIDO Alliance, and you've got Apple and Google are major players in the FIDO Alliance. I believe Microsoft too. And we're effective there because we partner with 1Password and LastPass and other players to unite in what is it we're going to ask of the Apples and the Googles of the world in the way they are starting to pave the roads that are relevant and impactful to our space. So I think you got to start from a position of respect, and then obviously, as I said before, that doesn't mean you're all the same. So you've got to ultimately find what are the differentiators that are honest and true, around which you can tell a story that defines the moat, makes clear what is the moat that defines Dashlane compared to its competitors.
Let's get into that, because I think what you're saying is powerful. You don't have to demonize your competitors to win, no, but you do have to differentiate, if I got that correctly.
That's exactly right. I think you don't even need to be talking about technology with a CFO to know that we're surrounded today, and here I'm going to maybe go a little bit on a tangent, but whether it's the political landscape, the international landscape, whether it is in social media, we're constantly faced by this barrage of pressures that have turned into a good and a bad, a good and evil, right, David and Goliath, whatever. Right. And although there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that, that doesn't necessarily need to be the way you act all the time with your competitors.
Do you have any frameworks or tips for communicating how you're differentiated?
I don't know if I would call it a framework, but as a non-technologist, right? So yeah, it's more of a modus operandi, right? How do I, as a CFO, who's obviously going to be in positions, whether it's like the talk we're having today, or who knows where, who knows with whom, I need to be able to quickly, succinctly, depending on the audience, be able to tell a story about what makes Dashlane different, right? And so I have some obligation to understand our technology to a certain extent. As a CFO, I'm going to take some financial perspective and point of view. Might be right, might be wrong. I'm sure there's an equally strong opposite that a competitor is going to take, comparing themselves to us. But I've got to figure out what are my 2 or 3 things. I don't need 10. Need, this is not a price list on a website that has tick marks saying what does the competition do and what do we do. It's what are the 2 or 3 things around which I can, from my heart, again, sorry to sound corny, but from my heart, tell a story that somebody can identify with.
That really resonates with me, because I worked at a cybersecurity company as well. And I was never going to be able to tell you how the code was different. But what I could tell you is that, listen, most security companies approach this through going to the CISO, like a heavy tops down motion. We are developer first. Okay, so that's one quality. The next quality is that the way that we go to market is we make it free to try, and it's product-led growth. So you can go on and try it without talking to a salesperson and see if you like it or not. And then you basically add on different qualitative pieces to it. And then it's okay, I've got that off as a CFO. Now I can talk about the numbers and how we've grown and evidence of why that's working and why we're different.
Yeah, that's totally right. I agree with you.
You've mentioned competitors can motivate teams by creating buzz and excitement. That one actually caught me off guard. And I feel like I'm looking at it through rose-colored glasses now. How does Dashlane approach differentiation when competing against giants like a 1Password?
Well, what I mean by sort of driving the team and create enthusiasm and buzz by comparing yourself to competitors is, imagine you're at the starting line or as part of a competition at the Olympics. You'd speak to athletes all the time, and one of the things they'll say many things, but one of the things they'll say is that it's competing with greats that drive you to be greater yourself. It focuses you. That's right. And so I'd like to think about that. And what's interesting in our space is we haven't taken the same road as our competitors. We've decided to be innovative in a certain respect in terms of our business models and our business model and the area we focus on. Our competitors have taken a different path, some of them, right? And they have their own differentiators, and that's fine. We have a Slack channel where we put up press releases and blog posts from our competitors. We don't only do that for awareness. We do that to remind our teams that our competitors are not complacent. They're not asleep. They're constantly moving. They may be chasing us, or they're trying to differentiate themselves, doing it their way. But that should be something that says, hey, I can't be asleep at the wheel here. This is a constant race.
I totally agree. And I feel like competitors can sometimes do some of the marketing for you because the potential buyer may not know that they have a problem. So you're trying to bridge this awareness gap. Now, whether they go and buy from the competitor or somebody else, but at least like it's out there in the ether. People are talking about it.
Yeah, that's right. And, back to the point you said earlier, which is so true, which is remember what made you special, right? And, we were talking about that earlier. I think here, the way competitors talk about each other should not force you to always be sort of context switching. Just because your competitor says one thing about you does not mean you need to have a rebuttal for just that point. Now, I'm not a salesperson. I have so much respect for that team. They deal with no 99 times out of 100. Okay, maybe it's only 9 times out of 10. But the point is they have that tolerance for rejection, which I didn't go into that profession because I can't, right? I know my limitations. So they do need to be able to quickly have those talking points. But I do try and be aware and ask my teams to do the same, to be aware of, hey, don't immediately be pulled one way or the other, defined by the person or company that's pulling you that way. Define your own path. What's the way you want to what's the way I want to describe Dashlane, as opposed to I must define myself based on how my competitors define a difference,
It's funny because people do fall into those molds. Like if you look on a website, like your competitor may put like their name, your name, and then like all these like check marks along, like if you hit that feature or something. Yeah. But then like you go further down and like they're becoming highly specific. It's like, like saves all your passwords, like can expand to teams of 3 to 5. Then it's like likes dogs more than cats. Like they're just like adding things in. You're like, wait, I like dogs too. Like you feel like you have to adapt to whatever they're deeming the playing field that you're competing on. It's like, no, wait, just like be who you were before. It's okay if you have some overlap, but you don't have to just take their view of the competitive landscape and try to like come up with like some corollary to every single point.
That's exactly right. And that's what ultimately, maybe without wanting to, ends up creating differentiation, right? I'll give you a perfect, very, recency bias here, but a very perfect example at Dashlane. And it also brings us full circle back to the first point we made on competition, which is start acknowledging what you have in common. Know that you're all playing on the same field, right? For the most part, same rules. And so one thing we, about a year or so ago, came to realize, and this is across all competitors in our space, and I challenge any competitor that says this is not true to show me the data that says that. We all are challenged by the fact that the bigger the company that buys Dashlane as a credential management tool, the lower the adoption rate amongst their employees. Because most companies see the point that you need to protect from bad password and credential hygiene, but they don't want to create an edict forcing all of their employees from using it. So no mandated use, like an SSO or MFA, 2FA, that of course is mandated use. But for password managers, so far, most companies don't do that. Hence, fast forward, you have lower adoption rates. So what we've done is we've said, look, the whole sector is challenged by this. And we know from speaking to IT administrators and CISOs that they're aware of that, and they recognize that by not having full use, they do still have a blind spot, no pun intended, to the discussion earlier. And so what we've recently launched, and this is a differentiator, no other player in our space is doing it, is we've leveraged our technology in a zero knowledge architecture to actually inform IT and the security team and ultimately the individual employee when they're using weak or compromised credentials, even if they're not using Dashlane to fill those fields, because we have that ability when the extension is in the browser. So it's, again, not getting too technical, but we were able to say, hold on a second, if the whole point is to provide value to the business decision maker, IT administrator or CISO, well, why don't we give them that visibility irrespective of whether somebody is using the tool or not? And at the end of the day, if that then turns into a heightened sense of desire to use Dashlane, for example, well, good for us, but that's second degree of importance.
Thanks for making that real for us. That was great. I want to talk about high functioning teams, especially in a growing environment. So like you said, you've been a CFO 5 times. That's amazing. Congrats. And a lot of these companies have been in hyper growth where you're constantly breaking things and you have to change the structure of the org. So I guess my first question is, how and when should companies progress from having these overlapping responsibilities to more specific and defined swim lanes?
Obviously, the caveat or safe way to start the answer, in my opinion, is there's no specific when, right? There's not one day when you say, okay, at this juncture, now we need defined swim lanes. The earlier stage will have many more jacks of all trades. And I'd like to think that for a long time, and, people can disagree with me. I'm sure there are people who do. For a long time, I hope you have a certain core group of people who will do anything for anybody if it's helping the longer projects and goals of the company. And I can have a long laundry list of things I've done that are way outside of what you'd think is in the job description of a CFO still today, okay? But I do believe there is a point in time, and maybe, thinking back, it might be around the time, and I forgot, you might know whether there is a term used to define this moment. I know if I was asking Pamela, who runs our people team, she would know, where you suddenly realize you don't remember everybody's name. Do you remember?
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. There's a term for it.
Yeah, it's escaping me now. Let's call it the Cheers syndrome or the Cheers threshold, because Cheers from the show in the 80s, where that song was, where everybody knows your name. There is a point in time where not everybody knows your name and you don't know everybody's name. My guess is it's somewhere between 100 and 150, from having been there a couple of times. I think it's probably falls around there. It obviously depends on the company, the logistics. Are you in multiple offices, etc.? But I think at that stage, you've reached a level of scale where a different, again, to use the word modus operandi, way of working is called for. Where we use the RACI framework a lot at Dashlane. So where you have just a defined, agreed, the whole exec team respects and agrees. For example, real estate is in my remit. That doesn't mean that other people won't be involved, need to be informed, are going to participate in making it happen. My people team is my partner in crime in many real estate related stuff, especially when it comes to workplace experience. But when it comes to decisions about offices and leases and anything like that, buck stops with me, right? And there is that respect and involvement. And now you think about every function and type of work, and there are many.
David, I think the effect you're talking about is the Dunbar effect. It's you can remember up to 150 people's names, and when a company gets over that point, you stop being able to have like the same level of empathy for everybody because you don't have a connection with them. You don't know their face. You don't know, like I said, their name anymore.
You're right. That is the term. I've heard it before, but it was escaping me.
I think it's real though, because like as CFOs, even at like a company that's 120 people, if I have a headcount sheet with like 90 something % accuracy, I think I can visualize every person within that. I know what department they're in. Even if I can't visualize what they look like, I could tell you who they report to at least.
Yeah.
But after 150, like that's really hard to remember. And then it becomes not lines in a spreadsheet, but it's less of a connection. I don't know. Would you agree?
100%. And you can try and do things to keep people more closely connected. Have buddies for newcomers to make sure they're introduced as an exec team, or as managers make a bigger effort to introduce newcomers cross-functionally to other people you work with. But ultimately, it's going to become tough, and there will be cultural implications. But more importantly, not everybody will know each other. So one of the other implications of that, which is very true, we're almost 300 people. I've seen, as I said, like double that, not more than 700. But you quickly see, and it's tangible. There are moments where, when decisions are made, you have high risks of up and downstream not having somebody thinking about the impact that what they're doing is going to have up and downstream. And I'm not pointing fingers, but just to give a crazy example, you could have an amazing, worthwhile, right on point marketing promotional campaign that doesn't consider, okay, I need support to be ready for the barrage of questions that are going to come in, or maybe that somebody needs to create content on the website to address these things proactively, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I've seen it in my own working patterns too, where like the HR team may be saying, listen, we need to move all the customer support people from salary to hourly because we don't think this is in compliance.
Yeah.
And they're doing the right thing. They've worked so hard. They even get a new HR module to go and track it. But they forget to tell finance and accounting, and they don't realize that it's 6 to 8 more hours each week for the accounting person to tally up that part of the payroll.
Yeah.
And if you were a smaller company and you were all sitting next to each other and you know what everybody's working on, that probably won't happen, but it feels more removed and you end up with this, I guess, domino effect.
Yeah. And what we've done at Dashlane in the last couple of years is, and it doesn't solve everything. There are obviously functional areas of focus and project-oriented work streams, but we've deployed something called offering teams. And essentially for anything, and you probably are familiar with the concept, but we didn't have it before. We only started a couple of years ago, where we've got a B2B, B2C part of our business. And each of those has a cross-functional, primarily senior, experienced within the world of Dashlane, and as I said, cross-functional team that is going to meet regularly to define what are the key priorities and quantitative metrics by which we're going to measure success around the initiatives that they drive. And they are able, because they're cross-functional, to always have all the bases covered. So that's been really successful for us, and we're going to do more of that in 2025.
It sounds like you kind of implemented some guardrails to minimize the downstream impacts of these domino effects.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, that's the thing. It's, you try and create those guardrails. That's right.
David, so I suck at OKRs.
Okay.
I have this pit in my stomach whenever I look at the calendar and it's time to do OKR planning. You were honest with me, and you said that OKRs were something hard for you at Dashlane for years as a company until you made them simpler. Can you speak to the simplicity there?
Yeah, there are going to be many, again, like my team knows I'm all about analogies, but there are many examples in business and in life where just because you read something or it's worked for one person, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to drop everything and adopt it either the same way or at all. Okay. And we learned a lot and made a lot of mistakes and failed completely in deploying OKRs at Dashlane in the early years. OKRs was back then like the hot topic. And so we needed OKRs, and we needed to not go from first gear to second gear. We needed to go to fifth gear, right? And so this meant OKRs for the company, cascading them down, individual OKRs. We had, back then, like still 200, 250 people. You need to feed that slowly into the organization. But we went much too fast, too quickly, much too fast and too broadly. And as a result, there was kind of a not overt or willful, but operational rejection of it. It just didn't work. The car stalled. Okay. So how did we bring it back? And I would say largely it ended up being rejected through ignorance, not in the sense that it became ignored. Like it was okay, I needed to tick a box, but I didn't truly value, and I say I mean our teams, the Dashlaners, we didn't truly value the power that was behind it. So how did we do something about it? And I wouldn't call it OKR 2, version 2, or a next gen. It was truly, I'd say launching a new way of thinking at Dashlane, or a more, not even new in the sense that we were not smart enough to think about it before, but I think a much more calculated, refined way of thinking about what we do. I was talking about a few minutes ago, offering teams and the initiatives, brutally prioritized initiatives that they focus on. Well, those initiatives they're not going to become initiatives that the company and the executive team is going to back unless we agree on the ways we're going to measure how those initiatives are performing. What are the leading indicators that say whether those initiatives are worthwhile? I'd rather have the leading rather than the lagging. Finance is really a lagging indicator. So what are the leading indicators that will let us know whether this is worth continuing and when are we reaching milestones? So I've got like 3-4 key initiatives we're working on for 2025. For each one of those, you could call them OKR, or you can call them O's, right?
Right.
And
that's what they are.
And the KRs, we already know what they are. And by the way, 5 KRs not necessary, not allowed, right? It's like, give me 1, 2, 3 KRs, key results that we are looking for, key metrics that we respect, obviously that we can calculate, but that we respect are going to help define and align everybody and really rally the troops, right? The whole point to OKRs, which never worked at Dashlane, again, in the early days, was it brings everybody together, understanding and rallying behind a number, right? So what are those 2, 3 numbers that everybody gets and everybody can wake up, and when they're thinking about their part of the job, they're saying, okay, this is how my success is going to be measured.
Because it's not going to be successful, and the body is going to reject the organ if people, A, can't explain what the OKR is or goal, let's just call it a goal, and B, can't tie it back to what they do day to day. So if you overcomplicate it to the point where like they couldn't explain to like their significant other or like their grandmother, like what the goal is, like, oh, we're trying to, get X amount of customers, something like that. And then they can't say, well, me in engineering, this is how I impact it. You lose the forest through the trees.
Yeah. And, the way you're just describing that leads to the word, storytelling. Our jobs are very much about storytelling, and whether you're talking about differentiating about a competitor, whether you're talking about your OKRs and your key initiatives, the values and goals for the company, you've got to think about your audience. And I talk to Taylor, our head of FP&A, all the time about it. It's like, what's the story behind the numbers, so people can really relate to it.
You can't have like just this naked OKR, like there's this number. You have to have a story with a plot and with characters. Otherwise, people are going to look at it like it's just this thing. It doesn't mean anything to them.
That's right. And especially when you're talking about very technical things or very quantitative things, chances are 80% of your audience doesn't speak that language. So how do you get to 90% of the audience understanding the story you're trying to tell?
One other thing that I want to reflect on that you mentioned, David, is the urge to copy what other companies do when it comes to goal setting. And everybody will be like, oh, well, Google does this where they, or Amazon does this where they reflect on everything in a 6-page writing memo or something, or Google has this framework where blah, blah, blah. But it's like, well, Google has $70 billion in free cash flow. That covers up a lot of sins and a lot of crappy frameworks.
That's right. That's right. And again, to take that broad perspective, we live in a world, and I have two kids, 18 and 21, to age myself a little bit. And so they're living in a world that's very social media full. And so I have some visibility over their experience, and it's full of noise around how everybody has solved everything, right?
Yes.
And so as an 18-year-old, and again, I don't want to get too off topic, but as an 18-year-old, you start coming into the real world, going to college and stuff like that, thinking, oh my God, I'm behind because my peers have solved everything. They've got 6 side hustles. They're going to retire at 30 and stuff like that. And I think the same syndrome, I think it's a grass is always greener syndrome, right? You always are leaning on thinking that your competitors have it all right and you don't. And yes, you'll know the color and the depth and the scale of your warts better than your competitors. But believe me, they're freaking out about other stuff.
I'm really glad you brought this up, because if it's a younger person who's trying to find their way in their career, or it's a company who's trying to benchmark themselves against others, it's very easy to see on LinkedIn or social media all these hacks or all these frameworks. But what you don't see is if they actually worked. People like to point to a quote unquote solution. A lot of times it's kind of empty calorie. It's just showing that you understand a methodology. You don't actually see the execution of the true results.
And you don't see the painful path to getting to where you are today.
Yeah, the years and years of suffering to make it an overnight success.
That's right. But mostly the things you and I have talked about today, that work for us, both have been a long journey. And they may not work for most companies out there. They just work for us. They happen to work for us.
Yeah. And also not to pick on Google, but if you're looking at a framework that Google used at the dawn of the internet browser, that may not work in today's macro environment or competitive environment.
That's right. And from listening to some podcasts recently on AI, who can avoid them, things are continuing. They're going to accelerate even more.
Yeah. David, I got a spicy one for you. I didn't know where to throw this in, but I know you have a good opinion on it. So I'm going to throw it at you. Okay. Should HR report to the CFO?
So I'd say that for very early stage companies, seed A, even potentially B, that probably makes sense. I mean, if you go back to the point that the CFO is there as the sidekick and confidant of the CEO and really trying to take care of all the back office stuff so that he or she doesn't have to worry about it. I think that's a natural appendage. But whether you're getting to that 100, 150 mark, or just through the natural scaling of the business, which is different for all companies, you do hit a point where you recognize one thing above all. And I remember that point when I joined Dashlane, HR reported to me. And about a year and a half later, we brought on a head of people. And two things on that. First, this happens when you realize that all the priorities and initiatives and objectives that you've put on a list that are related to the people function, whether it's recruiting, whether it's learning and development, whether it's performance reviews, compensation, whatever it might be, that they're afterthoughts. Afterthoughts in the sense that I've got a day job, just like my peers, and then when I have extra time, I'll focus on those things. The people function can't be run that way, right? And so you end up being very transactional. You get payroll right? You get variable compensation right. You get the basics. And by the way, that's why in those early days, it's such a natural appendage of finance. But there comes a point in time when you've got this constantly evolving culture. You have this yearning from a bigger and bigger team for more direction, for, again, people partners, performance development, working with managers, first-time managers very often, to how do I become a good manager? You need somebody who, and a team who's going to totally focus on that morning, noon, and night. And so the second thing I was going to say is, whether I think back, especially at fab.com and then now at Dashlane, I mean, the people function as partners in crime with finance. And Pamela, our head of people, is truly somebody I talk to multiple times a week, because we care about the same thing, but I can't do what she does, and vice versa.
Yeah, I have come to believe that the biggest accelerant to a CFO to make them good at their job is a really great people partner.
100%. And the second one, at a slightly different juncture, is a good general counsel.
Ooh, yeah, I haven't got to that point yet. I'm still trying to play a lawyer on TV. David, I'm going to take you into what we call our long ass lightning round. So I ask every successful guest, what's an example of something you've messed up on the job before?
Oh, it's interesting that you put that as a question in your lightning round, because it is in my lightning round when I interview people. And as as corny and silly as it may sound, obviously you can ask, what's the thing you're most proud of, big accomplishments, blah, blah, blah. But I always say that the three things I've learned the most from in my career were great mentors, existential threats we went through, running out of cash, competitive threats, whatever it may be, and making mistakes. And so, I say off the top of your head, like I forced a person, say, you can't wait 30 seconds or 20 seconds. The first thing that comes to mind, what is the biggest mistake you've made in your career? Because chances are the first thing that comes to mind is going to actually be more true than trying to impress the person who's asked you a question. So anyway, with that in mind, I obviously, being the asker of that question, have a few that have stayed with me since my early days. Fortunately, but by the way, I still make plenty of mistakes. But fortunately, the big ones are earlier in my career as a CFO. There's one that will stay with me, forever. The first big scare I got, I was part of my first startup, and we had we were strapped for cash. You're talking about just after the .com bubble burst, in the early in this millennium, and we had quarterly VAT payments in the UK and in France, and I forgot to in my cash forecast and I didn't have anybody in FP&A, by the way, so it was all on my shoulders back then. And I forgot to include, VAT, and it was hundreds of thousands of pound payment that was materially going to change our cash trajectory. So it gave me a big scare, obviously led to credibility issues with the board. We managed through it, but it's one that will stay with me. And so accuracy, attention to detail, big thing.
Thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
Because I know there are probably people nodding their head right now like, yep, I stubbed my toe on that VAT as well.
Yeah.
Next one. If you could tell your younger self something knowing what you know today, what would you tell them?
This may sound strange, and I'll explain what I mean.
Okay.
It's listen, but speak up. And it comes from two different lessons I've had over time. When I was in venture capital, I was in London, worked with two partners, and one of them was a guy named Hervé de Forêt, a huge force in corporate finance. Had been the treasurer of BMW, the CFO at Carrefour, real expert over many decades. And when I was able to observe how he acted in board meetings, I learned so much about listening. I was never one to jump and talk. I usually listened more naturally, but there's so much power in that. He would sit at a board meeting and just listen. And he was, by the way, by far the smartest, most experienced person in the room, but he would just listen, observe, let others have the credit for speaking up. Because if, let them say what comes on their minds, reserve the things that really matter. And then at some point during the board meeting, he would say one thing and it would change the trajectory of the discussion. It would be the true essence of the strategic dialogue. And if you've got a good functioning board, you probably have one or two people who are like that. And, I remember him fondly, and I will always, and I've taught my kids that lesson. Like, that's something that stays with me. Just listen. You don't have to speak every time a question is asked. You don't need to participate in every discussion. Listen, observe, think, speak when it's really going to be impactful, right? Now, on the flip side, I said speak up, and speak up is about the mistakes I made at fab.com, for example. But I think we all make those mistakes, which is, especially like, let's say, as a high functioning executive team, if there's something that's being said or contemplated, especially before a decision is made, speak up if you disagree. Ideally have data-driven, data-informed reasons for it. Don't sit back and say, well, I'm going to be the minority speaking against it, or I'm going to be the only naysayer. No. Say your piece. You don't want to get to a point where you've made mistakes and then go over and over it in your head, asking yourself, what if I had spoken louder? Right. And I have examples like that from my experiences where I still ask myself, what would have been had I pounded my fist a little bit?
And you also wonder if by you speaking up, you give someone else the courage to speak up, and maybe you weren't really in the minority all along.
You're totally right. Back to the whole issue of empathy. You may need to be the first one to step out of your comfort zone and speak up. And suddenly you realize there are a few who feel the same way. Good point.
Thank you for sharing that. That was powerful.
Yeah, of course.
More of a technical one. Can you walk me through your finance software stack? What tools does your team use to get the job done?
It's rather simple. And I'd say maybe for a series, we're a Series D company, but 5 years since our Series D, we're a pretty late stage company.
Yeah.
It may surprise you. I mean, we have NetSuite. Years ago, we moved from QuickBooks to NetSuite. But we still do most of our FP&A motions in Excel. RevRec is still in Excel. That I'd love to change, but it still is in Excel. But we use Bill.com, Expensify. We use Vendor to help our purchasing. They've been, very helpful over the years. We have Avalara for all the sales tax and VAT. What am I forgetting? We use Carta like most companies.
Nice.
Although I'll be the first to admit, I always keep a backup, not a download from Carta. I still have my own cap table that I maintain in Excel, and it's a good.
Do you really?
Yeah, I do. And I'll say
that's impressive.
It's come to save me in a couple
impressive or crazy. I'm actually not sure which one, but say more about that. So it helped.
So it's come to help a few times over the years. First, call it paranoia. What happens if Carta has an outage, right? Like,
yeah.
And I need my cap table. How am I sure I've got it? Number two, it just makes it easier if I need spot conversations and about topics, but where I can have much more flexibility to analyze the data in an environment I'm comfortable with, right? I'm always going to be more comfortable in Excel than in somebody else's tool where I've got to define and pull a report. And then finally, this is a nice little add-on, I have to say, although I don't use it every year, but having a backup and being able to switch to a competitive product if a pricing renewal negotiation doesn't go a certain way gives me a little bit more confidence. Carta's not the only game in town, although I am so impressed by the way they have built their service and their tool set. They deeply know not only the needs of the CFO, but they have a real strategy behind what they're going to add to their tool set. I mean, very, very impressive company. So I'm a big fan, but I like, go back to blind spots. I like to make sure that if it's going to be the cap table, like you can't be off by one. Okay. That's one thing where there is no room for error. There's no materiality. Materiality is anything different from the truth.
Some people play video games on weekends. I do scenario waterfall modeling in Carta.
There you go.
All right. Last one I got for you. What's the craziest thing you've ever had someone try to expense? You've been a 5-time CFO.
Well, it would be too much of a soft answer if I were to say gym membership, because that can happen in a seed company. But but it has to be bigger. Look, the biggest expense migraine headache I've ever had was somebody with, I assume, all best intentions went out and bought, I think it was 1 million boxes, cardboard boxes for shipping, shipping product without both running what was, I think, hundreds of thousands of dollar purchase.
Like an RFP or anything?
Without running, no RFP, not running it by finance, and most of all, not running it by logistics. So essentially, our head of logistics, who's responsible for running warehouses, suddenly had tractor trailers arriving with, multiple tractor trailers arriving with 1 million boxes. And this was the height of the Christmas, New Year's holiday season. There was no place for the damn boxes. So it caused a up and downstream problem. It was absolute chaos. So it goes beyond just saying, really, you went out and expensed this? Maybe we needed those boxes, but it was not thought through.
That's the domino effect we were talking about, David.
Definitely.
This convo has been a blast. It's been very meaningful to me, a young CFO, to get to spend time with you. So thank you so much for carving time out for us.
Thank you so much, CJ. It was a pleasure.
Run the Numbers is a mostly LLC production. Yelling an intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by some AI thingamajig. Podcast and video editing is done by Cleancast at cleancast.io. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses, LOL. If you like this podcast, please hit subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And also check out mostlymetrics.com. That's my newsletter where I explore business models and financial metrics. Thanks for riding with me. Share this with your friends. Peace.